Chapter 1. "Ready?" the shout carried in the wind. "Ready!" Derora Saxen hollered, and then caught her helmet as it slipped sideways. She bit down on a curse, but it was too late, and her hand was already snatching up the lance from the boy. He flinched and scuttled back. She grinned as the polearm slid into balance at her side, and she angled it at her opponent. Her gaze flitted to the center of the field, watching for the flag. Swish. She imagined the sound of the flapping banner, but couldn't actually hear it over the blood pounding in her ears. She leaned into the saddle as the horse under her heaved and surged forward. Her grin widened. She shifted her lance's tip up to hit higher on her opponent's chest as she studied his charge. He realigned his lance too, but it wobbled in the last half-second. She struck first, a solid blow that reverberated through her arm and torso. Her competitor's lance clipped her left shoulder exactly when he lost control of his mount. She grunted as the horse beneath her spooked. It bucked, and she scrambled for purchase on the pommel with her left hand as the entire saddle slid to the right. She threw her lance out wide and cleared herself of the galloping animal. As she was falling, she caught sight of her opponent also tumbling off his mount. The ground hit harder than the lance, and the impact echoed throughout her body, forcing out the breath left in her lungs. Groaning, she rolled onto her back. She propped her head against the dirt to see where her horse had charged off without her. Spikes of pain shot through her arm and chest as she sat up and winced. Someone at the edge of the meadow was chasing after her pony, while the rest of the dozen or so kids stared at her and her opponent in awe. She eased off the cheap pot helm to reveal dark hair and green eyes. She was 17 summers and never bothered to comb her hair. Instead, she diverted her potential to things she enjoyed, like swords and horses. She brushed some dried leaves from her shirt, wincing as she raised her arm. Then she stood before anyone could offer a hand up. She steadied her breath as she glanced around the small meadow where they practiced. Their battlefield was hidden from sight of the village of Riversbridge, and it was where the youth met to escape their daily chores. She massaged her shoulder as she walked up to her opponent and grinned. He rubbed his chest as his smile spread. "Dares again." She narrowed her gaze. "What?" He adopted an innocent expression. "Nothing, Dare. Dare. Your name is said the same way for a good reason." She rolled her eyes as she turned toward the direction the ponies had run. He wheezed. "We need spurs." "No, we need actual war horses, Donley. These ponies aren't that." Dare stiffened at the burning glare of the redhead 2 months her junior marching at them. "The both of you need armor, or at least padding in your shirts," Avice scolded. She had already folded the blanket they used for a flag. She was the seamstress's daughter and provided the 3 blankets, 1 as the flag, and 2 to soften the blows on the ends of the blunt wooden lances that Donley had cut. They were lucky neither of the so-called lances had broken yet, since Donley hadn't refined them, and, in fact, they were little better than planks. Dare turned away from Avice to her father's plow pony that one of the children had led back. He jigged and hopped to the side, whinnying. She reached up and scratched between its ears. "It's all right, boy. See? We're done. You did well today." Donley stretched. "Mine spooked too when I fell off. You'd reckon they'd be used to it by now." He glanced over at his younger sister, who was holding their pony's bridle. Dare chuckled. "But they're not as bad as they used to be." "Don't worry about the silly horses." Avice slapped Donley on his shoulder. "Are either of you hurt?" Donley forced a smile, trying not to wince. Dare patted her pony's neck. "I'm fine. Don took the worst blow today." Around them, the children settled across the grass as they pulled out their lunches. Dare wrestled her sandwich free from her saddlebags and sat on the ground. She raised it to her nose and inhaled the scents of cheese, lettuce, and mutton. She had even sneaked in some pepper. Then she caught the wide-eyed stare of a child. The freckled girl wasn't even blinking. She was about 7 years, wore a plain green dress, and had dried mud ringed around her bare feet. She also had no food in her hands. Dare passed down her sandwich. The girl grinned and snatched it up like a prize. Dare nodded and then waited for the others to eat while trying to ignore her stomach's grumbling. She shaded her eyes as she glanced up at the sun. We've spent enough time out here. Their parents would know where they had been, of course, but they never asked. Dare figured they remembered their days in the meadow, except for her folks, who in the village hadn't played here when they were young. She made a face, thinking of her generation, and if they would ever ask their children what they did in the meadow. Donley wiped the crumbs from his clothes as he stood, but Dare was only half listening as he dismissed the gathered youth. She walked back to town with her pony trailing behind her. Someone had tied the reins on the saddle, but the pony still followed as though she were leading him. The cool breeze teased her cheeks, and she could hear the dried leaves crinkling on the trees. She didn't notice as the others around her dispersed and took different trails. This way, they didn't parade back together all at once. She wandered between the houses. Their village boasted nothing as large as an inn, and it was mostly self-sufficient. It had to be. There was no castle or lord's manor guarding it, nor was there any road leading to it. Dare stopped in front of the blacksmith's. The forge was a square building that Donley and his father had built 4.5 years ago. Over the entrance hung the sign of a hammer striking an anvil, the symbol of the blacksmith's guild. She tied the pony outside. She pushed through the door. Kelin hardly had time for the meadow these days. She ran a hand over her sweating forehead. The extra heat was pleasant in winter, but not in the summer. Here in autumn, it was still a little warm today, she decided. Sigurd, the old master-smith, waved to her as she walked in. Then he hunched back over whatever he was working on as he pulled a chisel from the pockets on his leather apron. She found Kelin sweeping out the back. "Almost done for the day," he trilled, pushing his broom as fast as he could. The young man had a hardy build, and his hands seemed too large for the stick of the broom he was holding. His dark, curly locks hung damp against his forehead, and he hadn't shaved in days, as usual. "You're done early, then." She grabbed the spare broom. "Had to happen someday." He dropped his gaze. "I think Sigurd's trying to get rid of me." He sighed. "I've been packed and ready for 2 weeks, but every morning I still come to the forge instead." She rested her chin on top of her broom. "And we're still only play-fighting in a field, not making a damn bit of difference in the world." She prodded him with her broom. "And you're missing out on seeing that world." He frowned. "I'll have to go. Someday too, soon. The guild doesn't come to me for the examination." Then they worked in silence, sweeping out different areas. Kelin presented his broom to Sigurd and pointed to the floor. You and the girl work fast. Well enough." He waved the pair off. Outside, Dare untied the pony and let the reins slacken as they walked toward the arched stone bridge. Kelin's house stood on the other side. The water wheel attached to the mill behind the dwelling rolled along with the current. They crossed the bridge at least 8 times a day and hardly noticed the worn stones underneath their soles anymore. She stopped in the bridge's center and looked up the hill in the direction of her family's farm, where she could make out the wheat leaning with the breeze in the distance. A whinny shattered the village's stillness. Dare spun toward the sound. She hadn't recognized it, and she knew all the ponies in the village. The stones of the bridge vibrated beneath her as several horses thundered between the buildings. Her pony flattened its ears, and she heard Kelin gasp in surprise. 3 riders stopped before the bridge. They had swords, bows, and wore leather armor. Cloth masks covered their faces. Dare felt her heart racing. These definitely weren't the few traitors that visited. She dropped her pony's reins and walked toward the strangers. Behind them, she could see Donley, Avice, and the others from the meadow staring. The townsfolk, too, and mothers grabbed their children, pulling them back. Sigurd stepped out of his forge carrying a hammer. In the middle of the way, she saw Auric, the village's skinny, self-proclaimed Lord Mayor, freeze in place. The rider in front, a large, heavy man, dismounted. He wasn't fat, built more like a bear instead, and he towered over her as her feet carried her forward. The other 2 riders also swung off their horses and left their hands near their swords. Dare inhaled, licked her lips, and forced out, Are you lost?" The heavy man glared down at her. She thought she saw the hints of a sneer underneath the mask. One of the men behind him pulled the cloth down from his face and offered a smile. "Didn't mean to startle anyone. We're hunting the outlaw." He moved close to Dare. She kept her gaze locked on the man in front of her. "Outlaw? There's no law here to break. Not even a knight lives out this way." The third man twisted toward the one who had spoken and chuckled. "Told you this was the most backwater part of the kingdom, which is why he'd come here." Dare turned her attention back to the heavy man, who hadn't moved. Something sparkled, half hidden beneath his tunic and armor. She reached for it and pulled out a polished, black medallion of a serpent's body supporting a striking head on each end. She'd never seen anything like it. "What's—" The smile fled from the second rider's face. He drew his sword and thrust it into the large man's side. Dare didn't move as the man gasped and fell. His collapse yanked the medallion from her grasp. Kelin was shouting and the man was seizing on the ground, but the snake had her hypnotized. "We didn't know," someone shouted through a fog. A power able to overflow the chalice of all her dreams descended all around her. She flinched at an overriding sensation of astonishment, shock even, but it wasn't hers. The impression of a voice crashed down with the weight of mountains. "I'm surprised to see you again after all this time, enemy mine." She threw her arms over her head to protect herself, but she knew it wouldn't save her. The voice was enough to snuff out her life as easily as a candle flame. Distantly, she heard the uneven rhythm of hooves as the riders bolted. She pulled her sleeve over her hand and wiped the fingers that had touched the medallion. She blinked her eyes back into focus at the movement in front of her. Sigurd was bending over the body at her feet. He removed a pair of tongs from his apron and lifted the snake pendant and its chain out from underneath the corpse's head. He raised his voice. "Kelin, down, Dare, go dig a hole. Then build a fire hot enough to melt this." "What about the forge?" Kelin waved toward the building. "I ain't taking this inside." "Did anyone else hear a something?" Dare rubbed her hands together and held her arms flat across her stomach. "Hear it?" Kelin looked at her. "We all just saw it." "No." But the protest died on her lips. Auric inched up to the body. "What is it, Sig?" The old smith tightened his jaw and shook his head. "Just trash to burn and bury."